From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's take some emails from listeners, and we'll start with one on inflation. Thomas says that we are caught up in a convention of citing the annualized rates of inflation. So, for example, prices have risen 8.6% over the past year. And he says what's really important is the cumulative change in prices compared to wage gains from the relevant starting point, such as January 2021. Even if prices stopped increasing soon, the serious damage of the last 18 months is not gone because the cost of living has moved permanently to a higher plateau. And Alicia, I wonder what you make of that.
I think that's right. What we're actually likely to see going forward, or let's hope, is disinflation, where the increases in prices just slow rather than actually fall. I mean, we may actually see some kind of deflation in certain areas. Perhaps energy, in another year, the prices will actually fall back down to $4 for a gallon of gasoline versus where they've been for the past several months, over $4. So you may see in some places actual price declines, especially if you use developer. We see more competition. Smartphone prices have actually been declining over the last year, in part because you're seeing actually more competition from Samsung and new entries of lower cost phones. But the overall wages are going to continue to increase. I mean, the real wages right now are falling. This latest jobs report showed that wages are still increasing at a pretty rapid rate at 6% on a monthly basis year over year. Higher wages are going to continue to flow into higher prices, especially in services. Energy prices may fall eventually once the war in Ukraine subsides, but I do imagine they're going to remain elevated for many of the reasons we've discussed in the past about the left's green energy agenda, which has really reduced investment in fossil fuels. So those energy prices will continue to filter through into the price of goods. So yes, we're probably looking at a permanent increase in prices in most areas, though we may see some relief in perhaps energy and perhaps on the margins in food prices, commodity prices, corn, wheat, and those are actually starting to fall. But who knows whether consumers will actually get any relief in the coming months.
We've talked lately about the bill in Congress to reform the process of counting presidential electors. And Catherine says, certainly some revision needs to be made to the Electoral Count Act. However, in doing so, let's be conscious of the potential power grab that could result. She adds, I do not believe the governor of a state should be given authority to approve or disprove a slate of electors. And I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding of the complicated process here because the Constitution gives state legislatures the power to choose the process of appointing electors. In every state legislatures have said, we're going to give that to the voters. We're going to hold a popular election. And then the question becomes, who is the person who transmits the result of that vote to Congress to count the Electoral College votes? And in states generally, it is someone in the executive branch. They're not doing the appointing of the electors, and that explains this strange phrase you sometimes hear. So in 2020, for example, you can go on the National Archives website and find a certificate of ascertainment signed by, for example, the governor of Wisconsin. He's not appointing the electors, he is ascertaining who the electors are that the voters have appointed. But that doesn't mean that there is not room for shenanigans, Kim, and I'll go to another letter from Steve. He says, some states have passed legislation to cast their electoral votes based on the results of the national popular vote. The proposed law would go into effect once a sufficient number of states have signed up. But he adds that voters in a state might choose candidate A, but if candidate B wins the national vote, the electors for candidate B would be chosen, and he can imagine a rogue governor being enraged about that and maybe getting into this process and trying to say that he is ascertaining that the electors are for candidate A when candidate B won the vote.
Yeah, there are some real risks here. And by the way, just as that some background, this is what's known as the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is a group of states that have passed legislation in their states saying that the candidate who receives the most popular vote across the 50 states in the District of Columbia would get that slate of electors in their state. It's been enacted so far by 16 jurisdictions, which possess about 195 electoral votes, and it includes big states like California, Illinois, New York, but also some other left-leaning states like New Jersey, for instance, Massachusetts. It's still 75 electoral votes short of that 271, but it's also the case that in some other states that you've had at least one of the chambers vote to go down this road. So could you get a governor there at some point that took all of this into account, the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and also, these questions about electors and transmittal and decisions, and decide to kind of take things into his or her own hands? Yes, you would like to hope that in all of these cases that we have a Supreme Court whose job it is to enforce the Constitution would move quickly to make sure that we didn't have that kind of election mayhem. But I think overall, it's another warning and fallout of 2020 and all of these ideas that got to circulating again in recent presidential elections, not just 2020, where people seem, to want to overturn what have been long-standing practices. And we're beginning to see in so many ways how that can come to unsettle our system and backfire.
Finally, a couple letters on the electoral field. Bob says there's a suggestion Trump shouldn't run for the 2024 election because he would cause more harm for the Republican Party. But if he ran, Biden will probably also run. So if Trump runs, Biden commits to running, but then Trump loses the primary and Biden has to face a stronger Republican candidate. And Alicia, he asks if this is a feasible approach.
I think you would have to have a lot of Republican coordination. What we've seen in a lot of these Senate primaries is that you've had a splintered field where you have 3 or 4 candidates, and the candidate that gets endorsed by Donald Trump usually ends up winning with a plurality, but not a majority. And so that's always the grave risk in a Republican presidential primary in 2024 is you may have 6 or 7, probably more candidates running. There are many who are interested. And Donald Trump, even while he may not capture a majority, he didn't in the polls in 2016, he'll nevertheless continue to command a plurality support among Republicans and again, run away with the primary. And I think that's what the Republican Party overall concern is that even as Donald Trump's star fades, so to speak, that he will nevertheless be able to win a Republican primary unless you get some kind of coordination among other Republican candidates or the party overall to kind of winnow the field to prevent 2016 from happening again. And if you were to actually see that, there's also always will be the risk that then Donald Trump will say, see, the party establishment is conspiring against me, and use that for fuel. So I think there's still, unfortunately, a very strong potential and possibility for Donald Trump to win the Republican primary in 2024 if he chooses to run.
Finally, we've been talking in recent days, Kim, about the weaknesses of some of these, especially first-time candidates, Republican Senate candidates, Dr. Oz, Herschel Walker in Georgia. And Armando asks, what could have the GOP done better to improve the quality of candidates in Georgia, Pennsylvania, etc.? I guess I would throw out a couple ideas. One is maybe runoffs are a better way of picking nominees to the coordination problem that Alicia raises. Some of these nominees won with a third or so of the vote among 5 or 6 candidates that were running for the Republican nod. And the other is just to pick nominees based on the merits who can win the general election. And I would point to Arizona. You have a very popular Republican governor in Arizona, Doug Ducey. He would have been a great Senate candidate in November, I think, but he did not believe that the 2020 election was stolen. And President Trump made clear that if Ducey ran for Senate, that Trump would go to war with him. So those are my 2 thoughts, Kim. I'm not sure if you have others.
To your point about some of these primaries that were pileups that had, 5, 6, 7, 8 candidates in them, there's always been a lot of controversy within state party apparatuses about how much they should be involved behind the scenes as their competitors are going out to engage in a primary. And, I've always been of the opinion that more engagement is probably better than less, especially when it comes to those kind of crowded competitive primaries. It's not in any way an endorsement of taking away choice from people, but there is something to be said for a strong state party actually just having a quiet word here or there, managing candidates and trying to give voters a field that offers some clear contrasts, etc. I mean, in the end, you can't forbid anyone from running, but there's a lot of candidate management that does go on behind the scenes. And, we're now seeing, if you read some of the more in-depth press on this, some of those state party officials expressing a little bit of regret that they didn't engage a little bit more in this when they had a chance.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. If you have a burning question for our panelists, please email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. Please hit that subscribe button also on your favorite podcast app, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.